Okay, great. So we're in part 5. Anybody going to tell me what life stage of human development we're in part 5? Adulthood. Thank you.
Fun part.
The fun part. Yes, there's a theme here. The title of the chapter is Toil and Trial. So yes, it's kind of the opposite of fun. The adulthood section of the Bible that we're looking at today, I call it adulthood, not only is that because that's where we are for following the history of Israel as the life stages of a person, but it's where we are because there's so many issues that come up in this section of the Bible that are really about adults. The political issues come to a head in this section, where folks are preoccupied by their leaders, and we have the kingship, the monarchy begins in this section in Samuel. This is what we're reading, by the way, this semester in our religion classes here. So we have Saul as the first king, and David as the next king, and Solomon as the third king of Israel before it's divided. So we have the monarchy, and we have the issues that come up with monarchy, and that is the political system at the time, because prior to this, the system of leadership was a theocracy where God was in charge. And so when man starts asking for a king, ladies and gentlemen, why does he ask for a king? Why does the people ask for a king?
Everybody else has one.
Because everybody else has one. That's their pathetic reason for wanting a king. And God is against it. We're told that in 1 Samuel, that God is against that. And yet he still allows it to occur. Presumably because he's going to teach them a lesson. And unfortunately, it does teach them a harsh lesson. I'm going to shut the door and I'll be right back. So, when we have a king in charge of God's people, there's an inherent problem. Because now the people have a split loyalty. They're going to have to make choices whether to obey the king or whether to obey the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, of God, when they don't agree. Obviously, ideally, the king and God would always agree. But in practice, that rarely ever happens. In this chapter, you have some tables that show you the kings of Israel. There's approximately, I guess there's 42 kings total, 41 and a queen or something. So there's tables in your book on page 82 and 84 that summarize the monarchy. And I hope you were able to look at some of the trends of these tables. If you look on page 81, you have the first 3 kings of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. And when you turn the page, the table continues. There's the southern kingdom of Judah on the left. On the table, I apologize for the misprint. It says at the very top of the page 82, it says southern kingdom of Israel. That is a mistake. It should be the southern kingdom of Judah. And then on the right-hand side is the northern kingdom of Israel. And so you can see this chart is separating Judah and Israel because after Solomon, the kingdom divides. And this chart tells you, it shows you the reigns. In the Bible, sometimes we're told that so-and-so reigned for 7 years or so-and-so reigned for 41 years. And Bible scholars go back and give approximate dates, count back and try to figure out exactly what the date is. So the dates are approximate in this chart, but the number of years usually are verifiable in the Bible. So you can see, just looking at Judah, that they have bad kings and they have good kings. But if you look at the dates, in the parentheses is the length of their reign. Do you see some trends? You have bad kings, you have good kings. Can you just skim through those parenthesis numbers, the lengths of their reigns, and see some trends? If you look at the good kings, for example, and I'm just looking at Judah, the left hand of the chart. If you look at the good kings, this is the length of their reigns. 41, years, 25 years, 38 years, 17 years, 41 years, 8 years, and 28 years. The kings with the longest reigns in Judah are the good kings. So that tells you something about what God is doing through those kings. Because if you're going to have a long reign, two things are happening. Number one, you're living a long life. And number two, you're protected from your enemies. So if someone has a long reign, either God's allowing it or God is wanting it. It's part, you know what I'm saying? He's blessing it. So if it's a bad king and they have a long reign, then God is allowing that to occur. And that's what you see on the right-hand side with Israel. Because you can see they have 22, 24, 20 years, 28 years, 41 years. They're all bad kings. Thank you. That's the other thing I want you to notice, is that with Israel, every single king is bad. Now, of course, you could read this in the prophets and in part of the Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. But what constitutes a, quote, bad king? What constitutes a, quote, good king? Well, a good king is someone who's faithful to God. A bad king either builds idols, builds temples to other gods, worships other gods, tells God's prophets to shut up, or tells God's prophets to say something else other than something bad. Those are characteristics of, quote, a bad king. Now, some of them are horrible in the sense that they are oppressive and they're corrupt. But I also want you to appreciate that they are also, good and bad kings are reflected in how their attitude is towards God. And that's an important life lesson because this is Israel. But these kings are just kings because they're born to a king. And there is nothing about being born to a king that generates wisdom, faithfulness, loyalty, virtue, godliness. I mean, we had the priests that were set up as the descendants of Levi. They still messed up. You know, Eli's children didn't walk in his ways. Samuel's children did not walk in his ways. We saw that again and again, and that's because priests. Add to that power, money, wealth, ultimate power, then you get even worse, corruption. And so that is the lesson that God allowed to happen in Israel's history. I said to my students today that this is not a part of the Bible we tend to spend a lot of time in America anyway. Part of that is because it is pretty complex and there's 42 kings to keep straight and all that good stuff. But another reason why we don't tend to spend a whole lot of time in the prophets is the same reason why the kings didn't listen to them. We don't want to hear bad news. We don't want to be convicted. We don't want to be straightened out. We don't want to be reminded of the right priorities. We don't want to be told that we need correction or that we're doing something wrong. And that's the worst reason to ignore passages in the Bible. And so please forgive me. It's lengthy. It's involved. But I want to touch on it enough so that people understand the whole story. So that when we're in this arc of adulthood, just like we as adults are thrust into new and different types of, we're thrust into crises, really. Because as children, you didn't really have to deal with the crises, generally speaking. But as an adult, you have the sandwich of dealing with your children, but yet the illness of your parents. Or as an adult, you have the concern of your children being drafted or your husband being drafted and going to war. There's a lot of stress that any adult undergoes, and that parallels what's happening with Israel at this time. Because yes, they have a monarchy, but that only introduces them to the stresses outside of their promised land. They're not guaranteed to have it. They think they are, because they think God's in that temple, we're good. But that's not the guarantee when they cease to follow God. That was the promise. That was the covenant. It said, if you're faithful to me, if you're loyal to me, then I will remain in that temple. And he said the same of the kings. If you're loyal to me, and if you do what you're supposed to do and not what the priests are supposed to do, and that's what many of the kings, including Solomon, failed to do. They stepped, and Saul, I think we talked about that last time, but they stepped into the role of the priests, and that was a problem. God tried to keep that separate, and many lessons for us in the United States in modern times. But one of them is that separation of church and state that comes from these lessons. Others are that when you try to marry church and state, when they become one, like the Catholic Church before the Reformation, corruption ensues. Those are lessons that really could have been avoided if they had heeded the prophets. Another thing that marks adulthood, along with the stresses, are things obviously like sickness. We have a couple more barren women, which is a stress of adulthood, whether you're the barren woman or whether she's your wife. We do have a couple more, like I said, barren women in this story as it unfolds. Who are they? Can you think of who they are? You know of a barren woman in Samuel or elsewhere in this area of the Bible? Yes, Miss Emma. Hannah is barren, and Samuel is the blessed child that comes from Hannah. So the barren woman theme continues. We talked about Samson last week, and now we have Hannah being barren, and the great prophet Samuel is a result of that barren woman and being healed by God. We also have the theme of brothers. And remember, a lot of our stories of brothers in Genesis were young brothers, and their conflict was when they were still in the household. Now, the brothers theme gets a little bit more developed in one of my favorite ways, and that's David. David has many brothers. We may not know that part of the story as well as we do the other brother stories, but he does have other brothers. And his oldest brother is Eliab, and he makes some pretty harsh statements about David when he goes before Goliath. He accuses him of being conceited in heart. Who do you think you are? What do you do? It's interesting that in that story, you may not remember, but David's father sends David to check on the brothers, similar to Joseph. They're shepherds, similar to the Joseph story. So we have that little bit of introduction into the David story where we have David is the 8th brother of 8, and Eliab's the oldest. Eliab is jealous, and we as the reader don't understand why. We just think, wow, what's Eliab's problem? Why is he so quick to judge him? Because everything we know about David is good and faithful and true, and he's the young boy with unbelievable strength of faith and maturity, and yet Eliab thinks the worst of him. And then that's the end of his brothers. When he becomes part of Saul's household and plays the harp for Saul, and then eventually becomes king himself, his birth brothers are no longer part of the story. But what is interesting is what happens to this theme, and it develops and it goes beyond birth brothers or brothers by blood. But he actually develops an incredibly strong and intimate relationship with another man that's not his blood brother. Who is it?
Jonathan.
That's with Jonathan. And it's extraordinary, the language. It's absolutely extraordinary. Jonathan sides with David, even though his own father wants him dead. Jonathan is choosing brotherhood or the love of David over the blood relationship with his father. And he also makes all sorts of statements that are fascinating. He makes a covenant with David, and it's on the top of page 77 I'm looking at, that David and he have a covenant, and he says things like his oath out of love for him because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan loves David as he loves himself is a phrase that comes up multiple times. He gives him his cloak, he gives him his tunic, he gives him his shield, he gives him his sword, he gives him everything he has. It is extremely unique, this relationship between David and Jonathan in the Bible. And I would say that because it starts off looking like a brother's theme, and yet the brother turns to Jonathan, that they become closer than brothers, really. And then, just in case you think I'm on the wrong track here maybe, David marries Michal, and that makes Jonathan his brother. It makes him his brother-in-law. So he literally becomes his brother in the story. And then we have Jonathan going to war and eventually dying, along with Absalom and Saul and other people. Lots of death, lots of war in these stories. More stresses of adulthood. But Jonathan, when he sides with David, he's basically giving up his life. When he sides with David over the king, he has made himself a traitor. And he has given up his life as a prince to be with David. It really is an extraordinary relationship when you have that kind of emphasis and that kind of language that over and over and over again about how much Jonathan loves David and how their relationship was closer than a brother. You should ask yourself, why is that? What does it mean? And what does it connect to or remind you of outside the story? And it is a development of that brother's theme. And it brings it to an extreme. And it's saying, yes, we need to love our brother. But it's also in the law to love your neighbor, right? Not just your brother, but your neighbor. And then Jesus takes it one step further and says, love your enemy. And that's who Jonathan really should be, is David's enemy. But Jonathan is the example of loving David as a brother, as a neighbor, even though he's his enemy. It's beautiful. And it is a beautiful foreshadowing of what's to come when Christ comes and says, okay, love, so what? Love your brother, so what? Love your neighbor, fine. Love your enemy. That's a much higher standard. And that's the standard that Jesus raises. And it's a development of this theme. And it's, like I said, it's beautiful language. In fact, if you read the Jonathan and David narratives, it really does give you pause, because there's no other language like it anywhere. You almost expect it to be, why is it so overstated, is what I'm saying. What is the author trying to say? What's going on between these two? And like I said, you can't miss the brother and the brother theme being laid on top of these two. And then the idea that Jonathan is choosing his brother, and how much more meaningful it is when you choose your brother. It lends itself to what Christ is going to do. Because in order to follow Israel's God, you had to be related. You were born into it. It's a race. Israel's race. There were exceptions. Rahab joined. There were a couple of converts here and there, especially by marriage. But to choose, how much more meaningful is it if you're choosing to love someone, as opposed to, I just love you because I'm related to you. Both are important. Both are important. But it is a foreshadowing of what Christ is going to do, because Christ is a Jew. He is validated by the fact that he's a descendant of Judah and David. But he, Jesus, is going to open it up to anybody. Any Gentile is going to have a relationship with God because you're going to come through me. You're going to choose it. It's going to be based on choice. So there's a beautiful foreshadowing of the big picture of opening up God's love to all when Jonathan is choosing to side with David, which would have been against everything around him. And like I said, it was great risk, because at any moment, he knew when he sided with David, he was signing his own death warrant, so to speak. Big stuff, big stuff. So thank you for letting me walk through that. It's very exciting. And again, we are in this section, we have war, we have military defeats again. There's a lot of emphasis on Israel's rebellion for God, and we see that here. Rebellion at this point, the stakes are pretty high. Israel's described as being a stiff-necked people. I like that, if I can call it an idiom, a stiff-necked people. What do you think of? What do you think that idiom means? Because we don't use that phrase around 2020 anymore. So what do you think stiff-necked people means? Is it a compliment? Is it an insult? And what do you think it means?
Stubborn.
Yeah, I think stubborn is a really good way to say. What would make a stiff-necked person? Well, I don't know about a stiff-necked person, but I know a stiff-necked animal. A mule, a donkey. If you got a stiff-necked ant, they're going to go their direction. They're not listening to you or paying attention to the reins. So I like that imagery. But if you think about a person with a stiff neck, it's like they're holding themselves against anything else because they're going this way. I'm going this way, or I'm gonna go the way I've decided to go. And that would be the image we have as a stiff-necked people. But I also want to bring in the animal because that's what would have been very familiar to the people who are reading and writing the Bible, is what a stiff-necked attitude would be. It would be a stubborn. And remember, of course, because this is used in the Bible quite a bit, the word way. My way versus God's way. And so that stiff-necked people is an imagery that comes up here because they're interested in my way. And isn't that unique in adulthood? Because a child will rebel. A child will maybe not do what they're asked. But typically, when someone who loves them reasons with them, they might bend or understand. But an adult, especially an adult with power and pride, they can be very stiff. They're not going anywhere. In fact, we see it, I think, a lot in politics. Because once they say something, they don't feel like they can change their mind. I have to be consistent. If I'm not, they'll get me for that. Even though it has gone its course and it's ridiculous, they're still going to go that direction because they don't want to look like they're wishy-washy or whatever. And God forbid they actually say, I've decided this is a better way to go because God told me to go this way. And I wanted to go this way. But God told me to go this, they're not going to say that. No. Unless it's a theocracy or something else. So a stiff-necked people is another, I think, characterization that reminds me of adulthood. Because you are in control of your life and you're taking control of your life. And there's some examples of that are kind of anecdotal, I guess. We had Saul make some statement because back then if you were a king and you said it got written down, it's law. So Saul, after some battle, says something like, well, nobody eat anything yet. Anybody who's found eating anything is going to die. I'm going to have their life. And then Jonathan comes in from the battle, and he goes into the forest, and he sees some honey, and he sees absolutely no reason not to eat it. So he eats it, and he comes out with honey on him, supposedly, I guess, and folks are like, but you weren't supposed to do, because the king said if anybody did, then... But Jonathan didn't even hear it, and it made no sense. So then everybody was like, no, you will not kill Jonathan. And then Saul was like, but I said, and they're just like, no, Jonathan's a good guy, don't do it. And so he looks foolish. And he doesn't kill Jonathan. Because the people say that's foolish. So he looks foolish, as he should, because he shouldn't just be going off making these pronouncements without thought. Or, better yet, inquiring of the Lord first. Asking God, should I make this pronouncement? It seems a little, when the king or whoever's in charge doesn't check himself somehow, that's when trouble starts. And that's one little example of that. But as we've read, we've seen others where the king says something and then he has to sort of take it back, or it seemed like a really terrible idea at the time, and yet it has to be enforced. You don't have that problem when God's the only one making pronouncements. So thank you for that. David has a unique phrase used to describe him. Can anyone imagine the one I'm talking about? He is a man. Emma knew that too, didn't she? Yes, he is a man after God's own heart. Heart is used a ton in Samuel. When I read it to the students, I think like, oh my gosh, heart is coming up. Look, there it is again, there it is again, there it is again. It's a reoccurring theme in Samuel, but the truth is that heart is all over the Old Testament. It really, truly is. But you see it quite a bit here. I don't want to miss it. particularly since it's a unique phrase used for David. No other man in the Bible is called the man after God's own heart. That is a remarkable way to be set apart from everyone else in the Bible. First of all, there's an emphasis on man. He is a man, and we know the theme of man in the Bible is as opposed to God, right? I mean, man is true as a human, and it's used that way, but it's also in opposition to God quite often. So when we see he is a man, but he's after God's own heart. And then we see the mistakes he makes, which are, literally adult mistakes, right? They're rated R mistakes, right? So he literally makes mistakes. But notice, he didn't make those mistakes, those kinds of mistakes. We didn't see any hint of that foolishness until he became king. And once he was king, he had the porch that overlooked all the roofs, And when he was the king, he was able to choose a woman, any woman he wanted. And when he was the king, he could ask her to come and she would have no choice but to do so. And when he was the king, he was also commander-in-chief of the army. And he could find and assign any man to go anywhere. And when he was the king, he was able to ask the soldier to come home. And he had to come. And when he was the king, he could ask that soldier to go sleep with his wife. But what he couldn't do is he could not interfere with the righteousness, I guess you could say, with the faithfulness of that man. Because Uriah refused to go be with Bathsheba. It was out of his virtue, out of his honor, out of his loyalty for his fellow comrades, that he didn't go and sleep with Bathsheba. And it's then that David said, okay, fine, I got to do something else. And in desperation, gave Joab the orders to kill Uriah at the front, or have Uriah killed at the front. And all of that, of course, is a very adult situation. You got the military, you got the manipulation, you've got the self-preservation, and you have the self-deception. Because David, it was not until Nathan held the mirror up to him in the verse of a story that he was even aware, apparently, of what he'd done. When he was made aware of what he'd done wrong, or that other people knew about it, he then had a sincere confession. And, Psalm 51, we have that record of his confession with his sin and how sorry he was, and as best we can tell, how he did not do anything like that again. And, more importantly, the fruit of that confession is that God blessed him, allowed him to reign for 33 or 40 years, depending on where you're looking in the Bible. But he's allowed to reign for a long time, and he's also blessed by God. The only consequence he has for that sin is that because he confesses, is that he's not going to be allowed to build the temple. There's somewhere else in the Bible that also tells us he's not allowed to build the temple because he was a man of war, that he was a man of the sword. So, one reason or the other, he's not allowed to build the temple, and that Solomon is. And then we find out Solomon's not much better. So, we can say the Bible's about men, written by men about men, but it's not a pretty picture. It's not a pretty picture. But at any rate, we do have covenant come up, like we said, between Jonathan and David. They have a covenant. David has a covenant with God. He's allowed to continue and reign as king, and his kingdom will reign forever. That is quite a blessing, given after his foolishness. That's incredible mercy. And then, of course, we have, like I said, the covenant with David and God, and that covenant does include the building of the temple, which Solomon is allowed to do. Any questions so far before I go on? Anything else? I'll read the summary here, which is in your appendices. That adulthood is marked with toil and trial. Israel claims the promised land by the sword with clear instructions from God. Israel's lack of faith is her true enemy as she continues to struggle with remaining pure in the surrounding pagan culture and following God rather than her own way. Israel finally achieves her life goal of building the temple of the Lord, with Solomon, of course, and Israel struggles under wicked kings and eventually faces dark times of isolation. Israel is weakened and destitute. This is adulthood. And as you can see toward the end here, we're getting down to what happens as we age. We get weakened, we're more fragile, we are more dependent on others, and we lose some of our strength, not just physically, but we lose some of our strength. And sometimes we lose some of our mental tenacity and strength as well. Like when we forget things when we walk in the room, right? I can tell that's what y'all talk about. Yes, every single day. But anyway, we're dealing with adulthood because the next phase is death, and not to get too far into that, I will just simply say that Israel is weakening, and the kingdom is divided after Solomon, and that takes us to these charts in the book. I do want to talk just a little bit about Esther, Book of Esther. It is a fascinating book for a lot of reasons, but it is a standalone book. I mean, you can read it from beginning to end. You might ask yourself, why is it even included in the Bible? It is one book where God is not mentioned at all. He's not a character. He doesn't talk. He's not even mentioned in Esther at all. So it's a fascinating read to consider why it's included at all. But he's there. And there's no question that God is operating within his plan and his power in that story, if for no other reason than to say that there is a threat to all of Israel, and they are about to be part of an evil person's plan for complete annihilation. This is genocide. And through the wisdom and faithfulness of one man who saw a woman who's also faithful, together they're able to work it out through circumstance, which of course is outside of their control, but inside the control of God, that she might actually be queen, might actually be in a position to influence the king above this evil person. And then, again, why is that? Well, she's able to get the king's attention because she's beautiful. And I want you to appreciate that women, where do they get their beauty? Now, it's true, we can comb our hair, and there's things we can do. But generally speaking, beauty is considered to be God-given, in the sense that some women seem to have it 1 out of a million beauty, right? And Esther apparently is one of those women who's 1 out of a million beautiful, and that would have been attributed to God. And if you didn't attribute it to it before, you would attribute it to it afterwards, because it gets her in the palace. And we have that low-raised high theme again now with a woman. I want you to appreciate that these themes that we have throughout the Bible, I love it when they show up with women. We had the brothers theme in Brothers in Conflict, and it showed up with Rachel and Leah last week. And now we're having the low-raised high theme, and it's being developed with a woman in Esther. Esther's story is within the prophets, and it's a little bit later. Scholars date it a little bit later, but I bring it up here because of that. It has the low-raised high theme. She is a nobody in the beginning, but she's noticed because of her beauty, and she's noticed because of the plan of Mordecai putting her where she needs to be, and her faithfulness to Mordecai to listen to him. And then ultimately the evil person is overthrown because the king listens to her. And again, she could have been killed for showing up unannounced, but the king listens to her. You get the sense throughout the story that God's in it, but God's not named. And why is that? Well, it's written in a time when Israel doesn't hear from God. God is silent, so to speak. And in Esther's story, God is silent. We don't even call his name in Esther, but he's silent in Esther. The end of the story is clear that God's working through the circumstances to save his people. And I think that's an important message during the exile, when it seems like God is silent, does not care, and he's not there anymore. And he's not responding when his people call out to him. But Esther says, I'm there, even when it seems like I'm not, I'm there. It's 400 years of intertestamental period, and then he answers with a resounding Messiah. So that's Esther. Esther, I introduce here the idea of a type for Christ on page 81. A type for Christ. That's sort of a literary phrase where it doesn't mean the person is Jesus. It just means that God uses a Savior to save his people. That Savior, whoever it is, whether it's Moses or whether it's David or whether it's Joshua or Gideon or Esther, it's a type for Christ, because ultimately Christ is going to save his people, past, present, future, right? So when we look at the Bible and all the best attributes of the heroes, we get a composite of Christ. But Esther's one of those, and I point those out, particularly because she's a woman. But she is a type for Christ in this story. So, that takes us almost finished here with this section. Stop me and ask a question or anything you need. But as we talked about on 82, we have the divided kingdom, and you can see that Israel had not one good king. Not one. When you look at Judah, they have several good kings, they have several bad kings. But at least the good kings are allowed to reign for a long time. On page 83, Israel is no more. The kingdom of Israel is destroyed by the Assyrians. And it's 722, it's right there at the bottom of the page on 82. But the kingdom of Israel is a divided kingdom. So the northern kingdom of Israel ceases to exist, literally ceases to exist as a nation, like a death. I don't know what a pretty good definition of death is, cease to exist, right? So they cease to exist. But Judah continues. And the kings on page 83 there are the kings that they have after the destruction of Israel. And then Judah falls on hard times. In 586, Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed. The Babylonians are in charge, and they kick them out of the land. That's called the Babylonian exile. So goodbye promised land, goodbye Jerusalem, goodbye temple, goodbye land. And that period's called the Babylonian exile. That's the time, just incidentally, that's the time that most scholars believe that the Hebrew Bible took shape and was put together. They were relying on this past because they weren't hearing from God. And so they took that time to put the canon together. And some of the things that were oral up until that point had been written down and collected during the exile. When you look at the next page, 84 and 85, the tables are very similar. You still have the kings again. It's a divided kingdom again. But what I did here was I showed you the prophets. And I just want to look at some trends there. If you look at Judah, they didn't get many prophets in the beginning. Who got the prophets in the beginning? Israel did. In fact, they got some superstar prophets because Elijah and Elisha were amazing. And so you could argue that they got the superstar prophets. But then what happened? Not a whole lot of prophets. They do get Amos with Jeroboam II, but generally speaking, they didn't listen to the prophets. So God stopped sending them prophets. And then, of course, they eventually ceased to exist. Judah, however, didn't get the prophets early like Israel did, but they did get quite a few late. God is sending them people to explain what they have done wrong, ask them to repent and confess, ask them to remain faithful and true to God, and remind them, and more importantly, most importantly, give them hope. Because God knows, and it will happen, for the next 400 years, they will not have a prophet. They will not hear from God. But there will be hope, because God will restore Jerusalem, is the message from Ezekiel. They will restore Jerusalem, and they will have a Messiah. We emphasize that in Isaiah, but it's in multiple prophets. So you may remember Hosea as a prophet. He's the one that married Gomer, the prostitute, because God told him to. And then their marriage becomes a parallel to Israel and God. Because Israel's not faithful to God. Gomer's not faithful to Hosea. Their marriage is a picture that God's choosing to use to show Israel what they're doing wrong. Now, if that's true, and you read Hosea, it's spelled out that way, then how much more so is that true of the rest of the Bible? Why do we have any of these stories except for God to teach us something about his relationship with us? So that's why Esther is more than Esther, and that's why, Moses is more than Moses, and that's etc. They're all stories that have layers to them. But Hosea's layer's pretty clear. I mean, it's a husband that's told to marry a wife who's a prostitute. She goes out and is unfaithful to him and has other relationships and has children that aren't his, and then he's supposed to go back and he's supposed to continue to love her, because that's the image that God wants to show in a graphic way to his people. To say, this is you. You go out. You go after Ashereth, and you go after Baal, and you go after Ashtoreth, and you go after all these other gods. And I'm faithful to you. Why? Why do you have to do that? It doesn't make any sense. But yet, it's a very graphic picture, because that's what they need. This is how you're breaking my heart. I'm not just angry. I'm not just casting you out. This is how you're breaking my heart. That's what makes that image so beautiful, is it reflects on, yes, that's horrible what's happening here, but it really shows the heart of God being broken. That's a problem. So, all right, ladies and gentlemen, I end this chapter with Ecclesiastes. It's not the best, happiest part, I understand, but we're getting ready to do death, right? So, as you know something about Ecclesiastes, which is attributed to Solomon, you know this quote, probably the first quote from 1, 2, and 4, meaninglessness, right? Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utter meaningless, everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. You don't ever hear that from a kid, right? It takes time and experience. It takes toil and trouble. It gets to the point where life is hard when you come to that. And that's the point where, if you're blessed with a long life, we all get. Sometimes you just scratch your head and say, what is this about? Have I done what I'm supposed to do? How am I going to use my remaining days or years? And how can I use my remaining days and years in a meaningful way? I mean, these are the questions that Koheleth, or the author of Ecclesiastes, is asking. Those are the questions, but you don't ask those questions if you're not an adult. And more likely you're asking it as an experienced adult, perhaps even facing death, is when you ask these questions. I personally think there's a reason why the Ecclesiastes and Solomon comes at this time period in Israel's history, and it's wisdom literature. Because all that wisdom literature, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, it's all this period with the monarchy. It's adulthood. It's that phase of life that's adulthood. And unfortunately, we're going to have death next. So that's where we're headed. Let's see, let's go this way. Look, these discussion questions, a lot of them we've come across already, but is there any in particular that you want to touch on, or that seemed most connected in your reading, or any that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about? Otherwise, I'll pick one. I don't mind doing that one bit. Anything? Well, I like number 5 particularly, because it hits on so many of the themes. How do the following themes play out in David's story? I just want to point out that I've got 6 of the themes here, and they're all in David's story. I also want to say that the 7th one is the life stages of man paralleling the history of Israel. So, of course, all of them have that. So I'm just saying, in David, all 7 are touched on. We have the brothers in conflict that we've talked about. And I talked about David's brothers. I talked about David and Jonathan. They're not brothers, but yet they become brothers, and yet they're closer than brothers. And then I didn't talk about Solomon and his brothers, because they all get angry with one another and fight for the throne. That's what the divided kingdom is about. So we have the brothers in conflict, and unfortunately, it's not resolved well chronologically, but it was fully developed in Jonathan and David. What I mean to say is that Solomon and his brothers, his sons, fulfill the prophecy that the sword will never leave the house. And that's basically because they were a kingship. I mean, I think we could probably agree that if Solomon was a wise man and he had sons, they might have walked in his ways. It was the kingship that caused the conflict. And the younger brother is favored. That, again, happens with David. He's the youngest brother. It's a Cinderella story, right? Where everybody's, Samuel says, okay, I'm supposed to anoint one of your sons, Jesse. They all here, because I don't like any of these guys. And he's like, really? Well, there's David. He's out in the field somewhere. Well, go get him. So we have that Cinderella story where he has to be pulled out of some attic somewhere, not attic, out of the field, and come, and lo and behold, he's the one. He's the favored son. Change of heart theme happens. I mean, we have the most developed change of heart in David in the sense that we can read Psalm 51, where his heart is broken before God because of his sin. And it is culminating not because it's a change of heart, because I want forgiveness from a human. He actually has a change of heart because he wants forgiveness from God, because he's faithful to God and he knows what he's done could not only hurt him, but hurt the rest of his family. But he seems to be honestly and genuine, very genuine in the Psalms of wanting forgiveness to restore that relationship. It's played out beautifully. We see that low raised high again. Obviously, David went from shepherd boy nobody to king in the palace. And we saw that in Esther as well. Barren women. I have a bit of a theory about the barren women as it relates to David. I asked my students, I said, David's obviously a big, important character, a big, major hero in the Bible. Don't you think it's interesting his mama wasn't barren? Right? Because it seems like all the other big guys were. So we ask ourselves, well, who was David's mother? Guess what? She's not named. We don't even know her name. I think that's interesting. Not only is she not barren with an amazing birth story, but we don't even know her name. That's interesting. Who else doesn't have a mother? Who else doesn't? I just think it's kind of connecting, and David is connected in many ways, to Adam. Adam, of course, being the first man. Adam didn't have a mother. Adam didn't have a father, except for God. But it is one of many connections that we have with David back to Adam. But anyway, our barren woman is, in these stories, our barren woman connects with David because his wife Michal is barren and she's never able to conceive. In fact, she's the only barren woman mentioned in the Bible that is not healed. And we, as a class too, we discussed why this might be. Anybody want to give it a shot? She's the 6th barren woman mentioned in the Bible as Michal, daughter of Saul. But yet she is not given a healing. Miss Emma, give it a shot.
Well, there's prophecy given to Saul that his entire family would be cut off. If Michal had a child, that would be continuing his family line, so God was keeping his promise.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I hope the mic picked that up. Yes, Michal is the daughter of Saul, but Saul was prophesied not that his family would be cut off because of his foolishness, right? Mm-hmm. So, actually, because he took on the actions of a priest and he shouldn't have. So, that curse was for his line to end. So when Michal marries David, if they were to have a child together, that would have been Saul's descendant. That's a problem. Number 2, it also makes a problem if it weren't for the curse too, because whoever that child is would have been a child of Saul. He would have been in the king line of Saul and would have been the king line of David. And that would have probably produced some serious conflict as well. But nonetheless, you want to notice. You want to notice it. She is barren and she has no child. And that is the only example of that in the Bible. And so he becomes, if you want to think of it as the antithesis example, he becomes the negative example of the barren woman in his story, which is interesting. Makes you wonder when the next barren woman's going to come up, what's going to happen, and there is one more. Yeah, we'll touch on it, but not this time. So anyway, the barren woman comes up again, even though the example is negative. And then the covenant we've talked about too, that God has a covenant he makes with David, and he keeps it, even though David sins miserably. But it's very clear that David's response to that sin means the world. Because Saul sinned, and Saul got a curse, and that was it. But Saul didn't have a change of heart. Saul didn't ask forgiveness. Saul was not broken and interested in restoring his relationship with God. David sins, immediately goes to God, confesses it, writes over 130 psalms, but writes these psalms of love and affection and desire to restore a relationship with God. He had a change of heart, and that was everything. It meant all of it. In fact, his prophecy or his promise from God that his kingship would rule forever, it stayed, despite that sin. That shows God's commitment to forgiving when confessed to. So we have barren women, we have covenant there too. So I definitely wanted to touch on that. Thank you. I'm sorry we went over a couple of minutes here, but we have covered a lot that's already on this board. I feel good about it. Do you have any questions or anything you want to say? All right, guys. Don't miss next week just because it's death. We are going to go on to a little bit of part 7, so we won't leave on the death note. So if you can get ahead in chapter 7 just a little bit, it'll be good for next week. But come with what you can. And we've got 2 more sessions. Thanks for coming. Let's pray. Thank you for participating. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you so much for today. Thank you for the beautiful weather and our ability to meet. And thank you for the faithfulness of the people in this room. And I pray for the people who weren't able to come today that you would allow them to come next week and just be with them and keep them safe. I pray for the concerns that we all have on our hearts and minds when we leave this room. And I pray that we lay them at your feet. Because so many of our worries we have no control. And so many of the questions we have about the future we have no idea. But you do. Help us to learn to trust and have faith in you in every concern that's on our heart. Let us share them with you, lay them at your feet, and be content with the blessings that you give us every day. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.